The sun had barely risen that morning when Dr. David Carter, a well-respected pediatrician in his late 30s, was finishing his early rounds at the hospital. He'd already checked in on the newborns and reviewed the cases for the day. But just as he was about to leave for the clinic, he received a call that would change his life forever. David, the nurse on the other end, said, her voice shaky, "We've found a baby." At first, Dr. Carter thought it was a routine case of abandonment, a tragedy that, though heartbreaking, wasn't unheard of. But as the nurse continued, his heart sank. The baby had been found in a local park, wrapped only in a thin blanket, left alone under the harsh morning sky. The temperature that night had dropped to near freezing, making it a miracle the child had survived at all. When David arrived at the hospital, he found the tiny infant in the neonatal unit. The baby's skin was darker than his own, with features that hinted at a rich, yet unknown, cultural heritage. She was quiet, still, but the doctors were hopeful. Her chances of survival were slim, but not impossible. The more David stared at the little girl, the more he felt a deep, inexplicable connection. Something inside him clicked, a feeling he couldn't shake. He knew in that moment that he couldn't let her go. He knew that he wanted to be her father. Days passed. Dr. Carter's world, previously filled with the predictable routines of hospital life, began to revolve around this baby. He visited her every day, checking on her progress, talking to her even though she couldn't understand him. He would whisper to her about the world beyond the sterile hospital walls, telling her that she wasn't alone. He'd say, "You'll be okay, little one. I'll be here." And in those quiet moments, David made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would adopt her, no matter what it took. But David had no idea that this simple act of love would ignite a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Just as he began the process of legally adopting the baby, a man walked into the hospital. A man with a look of desperation in his eyes, a man who had the right to take the baby back. He was the biological father. The truth began to unravel, layer by layer. The father, a man named Marcus Williams, had been involved in a troubled relationship, one that had fractured long before the child's birth. He hadn't known his daughter existed. But when the call came, he rushed to find her, hoping it wasn't too late to make things right. Marcus, who had spent years battling his own demons, faced an entirely different world from David's. Where David was financially stable, successful, and driven, Marcus had been in and out of prison, struggling to make ends meet. But he was her father, and the law was on his side. No one, not even a compassionate doctor with the best intentions, could take that away from him. As David navigated this delicate situation, he found himself torn. He had raised this child, poured love and care into her since the moment she was found. And yet, there was no denying that the girl had a biological father, a father who, despite his rough history, had rights that David couldn't ignore. The emotional turmoil began to take its toll, and the situation became more complex with each passing day. David knew Marcus was not the same man he had been years ago. But could he trust him? Could he just hand over a child he had come to love as his own to a stranger who had barely been involved in her life? The court battle that followed would be a fierce one. Both men had strong cases, but the child's well-being, her future, was what mattered most. As David sat in his lawyer's office, the weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. Could he really lose her? Would the child who had come to know him as her father, who had laughed and cried in his arms, soon be ripped away? Could he trust Marcus, who, though sincere in his desire to be a father, had no clue what it meant to raise a child? Then came a twist no one saw coming. All of this, Marcus said, his voice low. "And I'm not sure I'm ready. Not yet." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Marcus, The man who had fought so hard to get his daughter back was now questioning everything he had once believed. Was he ready to be a father? Was he ready to raise a daughter he had barely known? David, in that moment, realized something. This wasn't just a matter of law. It was a matter of love, of choosing what was best for the child at the center of it all. It was a reminder that family isn't always defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up, who sacrifices, who chooses to stay. But as the legal battle continued and the child grew older, new questions arose. Could David truly let go? Could he allow Marcus the chance to build a relationship with his daughter, or was he too scared of what might happen if he did? And even as Marcus seemed to withdraw from the fight, there were hints that this story wasn't finished. One thing was certain, nothing would be the same again. And as the child grew and new revelations came to light, it was clear that the bond between them all, David, Marcus, and the girl they both loved, would shape their lives in ways they couldn't yet understand. The court's final decision was still to come, and with it, the future of a little girl caught between two worlds. But how would this story end? Would the biological father return, fully committed to his daughter, or would David, the man who had raised her with love, claim her as his own? The answer would come soon, but not before they all had to face some uncomfortable truths. What happens when a man who thought he had everything to lose realizes that, in the end, it might not be his decision to make? The final chapter of this story has yet to be written. And as they say, sometimes life's most unexpected twists are the ones that lead us home. The days that followed Marcus's unexpected admission were filled with silence. At least, that's how David saw it. The quiet was unnerving, leaving him alone with his thoughts in a way he hadn't been before. What had Marcus meant by those words? "I'm not sure I'm ready." Not yet. David couldn't shake them from his mind, wondering whether Marcus had meant that he was willing to walk away completely, or if he was just too afraid of what being a father might require. David continued to visit the little girl, who he had come to call Maya, every day. She had started to respond to his presence, her eyes lighting up whenever he entered the room. She knew him as her dad. He had been there for her every moment, teaching her to walk, listening to her first words, holding her through nightmares, and celebrating her little victories. To her, he was home. The idea of losing Maya, of suddenly becoming a stranger in her life, felt like a knife to David's heart. Every smile she flashed, every giggle, seemed to deepen his attachment, cementing his belief that he was the one who was meant to be her father. And yet, the courts were not on his side. They weren't concerned with who Maya had called Daddy all this time. They were focused on one thing: biological ties. It was in the courtroom where the weight of the situation truly hit David. He had gone through his share of medical cases, but this was personal. The judge, a woman with a reputation for being fair but stern, had made it clear from the start that this case was no ordinary adoption. Maya had a father, and that father had every right to fight for his daughter. Marcus had shown up to every hearing since that day, his face still grim but determined. His hair was unkempt, his clothes rougher than David's, and he didn't seem to fit in this world of legal proceedings. He looked like a man struggling to adjust to a life he had never imagined for himself, one where responsibility was suddenly thrust upon him in the form of a child he barely knew. His past, a history of poor decisions and even poorer circumstances, hung over him like a storm cloud. But what Marcus lacked in experience, he made up for in passion. His every word in the courtroom seemed fueled by a desperate hope that this wasn't too late, that he wasn't too broken to be the father she deserved. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't even known Maya existed until a few weeks ago. But once the reality hit, he couldn't back down. David couldn't ignore the struggle that played out on Marcus's face. There was a genuine desire to be a part of Maya's life, and that more than anything haunted David. He knew the importance of a father in a child's life, but he also knew the importance of stability. And what Maya needed, above all else, was someone who could offer her a safe, loving home. David was already that person. But then there was a new development. A third party entered the scene, someone who would push the whole battle into darker waters. Marcus's estranged sister, Lisa, showed up unexpectedly, just when the court's decision was looming near. She had been in and out of Marcus's life for years, never fully in his corner, and barely a part of his world. But Lisa, who had her own complicated history, was determined to see Maya raised in a family. She wasn't convinced Marcus could do it alone. The idea that he'd be a single father to a young girl, without the proper support system, was too much for her to ignore. Lisa wasn't wrong in her concerns. Marcus had made some real progress in his life. He had a steady job, was clean from drugs, and was working to rebuild the relationships he had broken. But there was no denying his shaky foundation. Lisa's entrance in the situation added fuel to the fire. She publicly declared that she intended to fight for custody, believing Maya would be better off with her, or perhaps even in foster care, until Marcus could prove himself further. David felt the walls closing in. Now, it wasn't just Marcus who was a threat to his place in Maya's life. It was the uncertainty that surrounded Marcus's entire family. Was there anyone stable enough to care for Maya? Would the court allow her to stay with a man whose life had been so unstable, or would they give her a chance at something more traditional, more secure? Each day, David felt more isolated in his fight. The more he learned about Marcus's history, the more David questioned whether he could really trust Marcus to raise Maya. There were no easy answers. The deeper David got into this mess, the more tangled the situation became. Could he trust Marcus, or was he simply another obstacle? A man who would pull Maya in and out of different lives without ever truly being there. Could David keep her safe from a man who, for all his efforts, seemed to always be on the edge of a breakdown? The tension between the two men reached a boiling point during one particular court hearing, when Marcus, his face flushed with emotion, stood up and pointed directly at David. "She's my daughter, my blood. I deserve to know her, and I deserve a chance to be a father to her. You've had your chance, but this isn't just about you. This is about me being a father." The outburst sent shockwaves through the courtroom. David, whose patience had been wearing thin, responded, "It's about her, Marcus. It's about Maya's future. If you can't provide for her, then what? You can't just expect to walk in and take her from me because you think that's what's fair. I've been the one raising her. I've been the one who's given her everything." Their voices clashed, and the entire room felt suffocating, like the air was too thick with unresolved tension. Maya's future hung in the balance, and it was becoming painfully clear that no one was ready to back down. The judge, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Enough," she said sternly. "I have heard enough from both of you. This isn't about your personal struggles. It's about what's best for Maya. I will make my decision soon, but know this, the truth will come out. This court will make sure that she gets the future she deserves, no matter how hard the path may seem." As David sat back down, his hands clenched into fists, he couldn't shake the thought that everything he had fought for was on the verge of being ripped away. Could he protect Maya from the chaos that was about to unfold? Or was this the end of a journey that had begun with nothing but love? The court decision was close, but nothing was certain. And with every passing day, the story grew darker, the stakes higher, and the future more uncertain. Would David be able to keep his daughter, or would Marcus' return prove to be the twist that changed everything? The days leading up to the court's final decision felt like an eternity. David couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the little girl who had been his world for so long. The stakes had never been higher, and the uncertainty gnawed at him every minute. What would happen if the judge ruled in Marcus's favor? Could he walk away from Maya, knowing she might be better off with her biological father, someone who was still trying to figure out his place in her life? Or was he fooling himself, clinging to a version of fatherhood that wasn't his to keep? Marcus, too, was spiraling. The quiet moments when he wasn't in court or preparing for his next hearing were filled with the sound of his own thoughts, which often threatened to overwhelm him. The truth was, Marcus didn't feel prepared. He didn't feel ready to be Maya's father. He had fought so hard to be a part of her life, but the deeper he dug into what it meant to be a parent, the more doubts he had. His love for Maya was real, but his fear that he wouldn't be enough for her weighed heavily on his conscience. In one final meeting before the court's judgment, Marcus and David found themselves in a room together, alone for the first time in weeks. The silence stretched on, neither man willing to make the first move. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "David," he began, his eyes shifting uncomfortably, "I'm not sure I can do this. I want to be her father, but I don't know if I can be the kind of father she needs." David looked at him, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had expected a different conversation, one where Marcus demanded his daughter back with all the force he could muster. But this vulnerability caught him off guard. It wasn't the confession of a man who had come to take Maya from him. It was the plea of a man who, for the first time, truly understood the gravity of what fatherhood meant. "You don't have to be perfect, Marcus," David said softly, his voice full of empathy. "None of us are. But you have to be there. You have to show up. You have to be willing to fight for her every day, even when it's hard." Marcus swallowed hard, nodding slowly. It was clear that the weight of his decision had settled on him, and for the first time, he seemed to accept that the role of father wasn't about being flawless. It was about commitment. It was about showing up, no matter what. And it was clear to him now that David had done that for Maya in a way he had yet to understand. The next day, the court hearing arrived. The air was thick with anticipation as everyone took their seats in the courtroom. Maya's future, her entire life, was hanging in the balance. David's heart raced as the judge entered, her robe swishing with a quiet authority that sent a ripple of nervous energy through the room. After what felt like an eternity, the judge cleared her throat and began to speak. "I have carefully reviewed the evidence and testimony presented by both parties. This is a difficult decision, one that is not to be made lightly. But after considering all aspects, Maya's well-being, the actions of both David Carter and Marcus Williams, and the circumstances surrounding her birth and upbringing, I have come to a conclusion." David's breath caught in his throat. Marcus's face was tense, his hands trembling slightly as he sat next to his lawyer. "I have decided," the judge continued, "that the best interests of Maya will be served by her remaining with Dr. David Carter, her adoptive father. However, I am ordering a gradual process of visitation and counseling to allow Marcus Williams the chance to develop a relationship with his daughter. Maya's future must be built on stability, but that doesn't mean her biological father should be shut out entirely. This is an opportunity for both men to work together to build the future that is best for Maya." The room was silent for a long moment as the weight of the decision sank in. David felt a mix of relief and fear. He had won the battle for Maya's custody, but the reality of the judge's decision set a new challenge in motion. Marcus would be a part of their lives moving forward, And though it wasn't the clear-cut victory David had hoped for, it was a resolution that offered a chance for healing and growth. Marcus, sitting in his chair, finally let out a shaky breath. He looked at David with a mixture of gratitude and guilt, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Marcus didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be real, and that was enough. In the months that followed, the bond between Marcus and Maya grew slowly but steadily. Visits were awkward at first, as Maya didn't quite know how to relate to this new man who claimed to be her father. But Marcus showed up, week after week, and each time, Maya's walls came down a little more. Slowly, she began to understand that family wasn't just defined by blood. It was defined by love, by commitment, by the people who showed up for her, day after day. David, too, grew in ways he hadn't expected. He had been her father in every sense of the word, but now he was learning to share that role. The relationship between him and Marcus, though not without its complications, became one of mutual respect. They didn't have to be friends, but they both had one thing in common. Maya. She was their common ground, and for her, they were willing to work through their differences. The years went by, and Maya blossomed into a confident, intelligent young woman. She grew up knowing that her family was made of both David and Marcus, two men who had come from different walks of life, but had found a way to love her together. And though her story had started in the most unexpected of ways, it had shaped her into someone strong, compassionate, and unafraid of what the future held. In the end, the greatest lesson Maya learned wasn't just about family. It was about resilience. Life didn't always give you the answers you wanted, but it gave you what you needed. And in this case, what she needed was both of her fathers, working together to build a future full of love, understanding, and the unbreakable bond of family. As for David and Marcus, they both learned that fatherhood wasn't about claiming a title. It was about showing up. And that, ultimately, was what had brought them together. Their journey had been messy, complicated, and filled with doubt. But in the end, it was a journey that led them both to the one thing they'd always been fighting for, Maya.